The dense shadows of night draped over the towering trees of the forest along Georgia Road. Robert Edwards, a 32-year-old millionaire with striking green eyes and neatly combed dark hair, moved briskly among the gnarled trunks. His tailored suit, immaculate and out of place in the wilderness, reflected the life of luxury he had built. Seeking solace after a heated argument with his new wife Erin, Robert wandered deeper into the woods, his thoughts circling like restless birds. But then a faint, fragile cry broke through the stillness, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. Startled, Robert halted. He scanned his surroundings and spotted movement near a thicket. Who could possibly bring a baby into the woods, especially at this hour, he thought, his brows furrowing in confusion. Driven by curiosity, he parted the branches, revealing an astonishing sight. A disheveled young woman sat on the forest floor, clutching a baby tightly to her chest. Her threadbare clothes clung to her frail frame, and her tangled hair framed a face etched with desperation. The woman's wide, frightened eyes locked onto Robert's, and he instinctively took a cautious step back. She appeared no older than her mid-20s, trembling visibly as if she had been cornered. The baby, swaddled in a soiled, tattered blanket, let out a soft whimper, its tiny face barely visible. "Hey, it's okay," Robert said gently, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you. Do you need help? I can call someone or take you somewhere safe." He softened his tone, trying to soothe the tension hanging between them. The young woman remained silent, her panicked gaze darting between Robert and the infant in her arms. Her fear and exhaustion were palpable. As Robert took another step forward, something caught his eye. His breath hitched. The baby had a small crescent-shaped birthmark on its left cheek, identical to the one he had carried since birth. His heart raced as he stared at the familiar mark. "This can't be," he murmured, disbelief washing over him. "That mark, it's just like mine." His mind spun with questions. "Who are you? Where did this baby come from?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of wonder and shock. Before the woman could respond, her footing faltered on a tree root, and she stumbled backward, her arms flung outward as she fell, and the baby slipped from her grasp. Time seemed to slow as the infant's tiny body was flung into the air, spinning helplessly. Robert's instincts surged into action. With his heart pounding, he lunged forward, his arms outstretched in desperation. "Please, no!" he cried, every fiber of his being focused on saving the child. The forest blurred around him as he dived, his hands reaching out just in time. He felt the weight of the baby against his palms and pulled it close, rolling to shield the infant from the impact as he hit the ground hard. For a moment he lay there, breathing heavily, clutching the baby tightly against his chest. The child's frightened cries pierced the stillness, a sound that filled Robert with both relief and overwhelming emotion. He sat up carefully, his hands trembling as he inspected the baby for injuries. "Thank God," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "You're safe." He turned his attention to the young woman, who lay dazed and motionless on the ground. Torn between checking on her and ensuring the baby's safety, Robert pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "I need an ambulance," he said, his voice urgent. "I'm near Georgia Road, in the woods. There's an injured woman and a baby." Minutes felt like hours as he gently rocked the infant, trying to calm its cries. When the paramedics finally arrived, the forest burst into activity. Robert handed the baby to an EMT, his eyes never leaving the child. Another medic attended to the woman, who was still unconscious but breathing. "Sir, are you coming with us?" one of the EMTs asked. "We're heading to the hospital now. You can ride along." Without hesitation, Robert nodded. His gaze remained fixed on the baby, a bond forming that he couldn't quite explain. In the ambulance, the steady beeping of monitors punctuated the tension in the air. Robert sat close, a mix of helplessness and determination in his expression. The baby stirred, its tiny fingers twitching, while the woman remained still, her pale face showing faint signs of strain. Robert leaned back against the cool metal of the ambulance walls, a single thought anchoring his scattered emotions. I have to find out the truth. Robert Edwards's heart thundered in his chest as he shouted, "Oh God, no, please, let me get to them in time!" The world around him seemed to slow, every second stretching endlessly. Just as he hit the ground, he felt the fragile weight of the baby in his arms. Instinctively, he twisted his body, rolling to protect the child from the impact of the fall. For a brief moment, Robert remained still, his breath coming in heavy gasps. He held the infant close, his arms trembling from adrenaline. The baby's cries filled the stillness of the forest, high-pitched and frightened, but unmistakably alive. Relief swept over him like a tide as he sat up, scanning the baby for injuries. He exhaled deeply, his voice soft but resolute. "Thank God you're okay," he murmured, as the child wriggled in his arms. His eyes then shifted to the young woman lying on the ground, her expression dazed and unfocused. Robert's voice quavered with a mixture of adrenaline and concern as he called out to her. "The baby's fine, but I need you to explain. What's going on here? Why does this child look so much like me? Who are you?" Slowly the woman began to stir. She pushed herself to her feet, her movements hesitant, as though her legs might give out beneath her. Her gaze locked onto Robert, filled with fear and uncertainty. A storm of emotions crossed her face, hesitation, desperation, and something else Robert couldn't quite name. She looked as though she was deciding whether to trust him or flee. Finally, her voice, raspy and unsteady, broke the silence. "I can't explain," she stammered. "He's not mine. I was forced. Please don't call the police. I didn't want any trouble." Her words hung in the air, fragile yet heavy. Robert's mind swirled with unanswered questions. Anger, confusion, and an unexpected sense of connection to the child surged within him. The woman clung to the baby, her grip tightening protectively, as though shielding him from unseen threats. Taking a cautious step back, Robert extended his hand in a gesture of peace. "Wait," he urged, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "Please, I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to understand." His words were measured, his eyes locked onto hers, willing her to stay. But his calm demeanor wasn't enough to quiet her panic. Her wide, frantic eyes darted around the shadowed woods, seeking an escape. "You don't understand," she rasped, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "I can't stay. They'll find us. You weren't supposed to see this." Before Robert could react, the woman turned sharply. She stumbled into the dense forest, her movements clumsy but fueled by desperation. The sound of breaking twigs and rustling leaves echoed in her wake as she vanished into the darkness, clutching the baby tightly. Robert stood rooted to the spot, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. The questions in his mind spiraled endlessly. Who was she? What did she mean by forced? And why did the child, a complete stranger, bear a mark identical to his own? The prison. The night felt heavier now, the once familiar forest suddenly foreign and menacing. Robert's instincts told him this was only the beginning of something far more complex and deeply personal. The baby clung tightly to the woman, who stumbled forward in panic. Robert Edwards called out urgently, "It's dangerous to run like that, especially with a child." The forest seemed to close in around them as the chase unfolded. The undergrowth was thick and treacherous roots snaked along the path, making each step perilous. Robert could hear her labored breaths and the baby's distressed cries, echoing through the stillness of the woods. As Robert gained ground, fate intervened cruelly. The woman tripped over an exposed tree root, her footing lost in an instant. It all seemed to happen in slow motion. She pitched forward, her arms flailing, as the baby slipped from her grasp. Robert's heart seized in terror as the tiny figure was flung into the air, a sharp, frightened cry slicing through the quiet night. He lunged forward with everything he had, his arms outstretched in desperation. "Please let me catch him," he thought. But his fingers missed the child by mere inches. The sickening thud of the baby hitting the forest floor echoed in his ears, a sound that made his chest tighten with dread. An unbearable silence followed, broken only by the harsh breaths of Robert and the woman sprawled on the ground. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Robert stared at the small, unmoving form before him. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, rushing toward the child, his heart hammering like a drum. With trembling hands, Robert gently turned the baby over. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Oh, God, please, please be okay." Panic choked him as he pleaded, "Cry! Please cry! Make any sound, anything!" The oppressive silence weighed on him like a lead blanket, stealing his breath. Then, mercifully, a weak, fragile cry pierced the air. Relief washed over Robert, leaving him momentarily lightheaded. He exhaled deeply, his hands still shaking as he cradled the baby close to his chest. He carefully inspected the infant for any visible injuries, his voice soft but urgent. "Thank God," he murmured, his relief palpable as he confirmed the child was alive, though frightened and bruised. Nearby, the woman lay motionless, her body slumped awkwardly against the forest floor. She appeared unconscious, her face pale and lips slightly parted. Robert's gaze darted between the baby in his arms and the woman on the ground. His chest ached with the weight of the moment, torn between the helpless child and the injured stranger. Shaking himself into action, Robert fumbled with his phone, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Dialing 911, his voice wavered as he spoke. "Please, I need an ambulance right away. I'm in the woods near Georgia Road. There's a baby, injured, and a woman unconscious from a fall." As he provided details to the dispatcher, Robert instinctively rocked the baby in his arms, whispering soothing words to calm its soft, pitiful whimpers. Each passing second felt like an eternity as he waited, the cool night air pressing down on him. His mind raced with unanswered questions. Who is she? Why was she running? And this child? Why do I feel so connected to him? Finally, the distant sound of sirens broke through the suffocating quiet of the forest. Flashing lights bathed the trees in eerie hues as the paramedics arrived, bringing a flurry of activity. Robert handed the baby over to an EMT, his eyes never leaving the child. Another medic rushed to attend to the woman, checking her vitals and preparing her for transport. "Are you coming with us, sir?" one of the EMTs asked, glancing at Robert. "We're heading to the hospital now." Without hesitation, Robert nodded, his gaze fixed firmly on the tiny, fragile figure now in the hands of the paramedics. His connection to the baby was unshakable, inexplicable, yet profound. He didn't know what the answers would be, but he was determined to find out. As the ambulance doors closed behind him, Robert sat beside the baby, his heart heavy with questions, his resolve growing stronger with every passing mile. This was no longer just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something far greater than he could yet comprehend. The scene buzzed with urgency as Robert Edwards reluctantly handed baby Jason to a waiting EMT. His anxious eyes followed every move as they carefully examined the child. Nearby, another paramedic worked on the unconscious woman, preparing her for transport. "Sir, you riding in the ambulance?" one of the EMTs asked, turning toward Robert. "We're heading to the hospital immediately. Will you come along?" Without hesitation, Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on Jason, unable to look away. And a few years later, Robert said, Robert fell in. Inside the ambulance, the atmosphere was thick with tension, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors. The devices tracked the vital signs of both the baby and the woman lying nearby. Robert sat motionless, a deep sense of helplessness settling over him as the paramedics worked. Suddenly, a faint stir broke through the stillness. The woman's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her face as they locked onto Robert. Robert, thank goodness you're here," she murmured weakly, her voice barely audible. "I need to talk to you. I don't feel well, and there's something I must tell you." Her words hit Robert like a jolt. How does she know my name, he wondered, leaning closer, his brow furrowed with suspicion. How do you know me? What is it you need to say? He asked, his voice tense. The woman tried to sit up, but the paramedic gently restrained her. Pain etched across her features, yet her determined gaze didn't waver. "The baby," she began, her voice almost inaudible. But before she could continue, a sudden alarm pierced the air. The monitors erupted into a cacophony of frantic beeping. The color drained from her face as her eyes rolled back. "She's going into shock," a paramedic called out urgently. They moved swiftly to stabilize her, forcing Robert to step back. He stood frozen, his chest tight, as he watched the team work with frantic precision. The ambulance filled with a blur of activity, the sirens outside wailing relentlessly. The ride to the hospital felt endless, yet Robert's mind churned faster than ever. Questions swirled, but no answers came, only the haunting uncertainty of what lay ahead. The sound of shouting and the relentless pulse of monitors filled the air. As Robert Edwards arrived at the hospital, he was swept into a whirlwind of chaos. Watching baby Jason and the unconscious woman being hurried away, a nurse gently directed him toward the waiting room. "We're doing everything we can. Please wait here," she said with a calm, reassuring tone. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Robert paced restlessly, his mind playing and replaying every moment of the night. Her haunting words echoed in his thoughts. "The baby he is." What did she mean? How did she know his name? Why did Jason bear an identical birthmark to his own? But there was no proof. It was the middle of the night, and they were both sleeping. The resemblance, like a mirror of his younger self, was undeniable and unsettling. Suddenly, commotion erupted in the hallway. Nurses hurried past, their faces tense with worry. Robert's heart raced as he strained to catch fragments of their hushed conversations. "The baby's vitals are plummeting. Critical desaturation. If we don't act quickly, we could lose him." Panic surged through Robert, gripping him like a vice. Desperate, he sprang to his feet, ready to follow the nurses, only to be stopped by a hospital security guard. "Please, sir, let the doctors do their job," the guard said firmly, though there was sympathy in his tone. Robert staggered back, his legs barely holding him up. Leaning against the wall, he murmured softly, "Please, God," as tears welled in his eyes. "Don't let this baby die. I need answers. I need to understand." Time crawled by, every second an agonizing weight of fear and uncertainty. Then finally a doctor appeared, his face etched with exhaustion yet tinged with relief. "The baby's stable now," the doctor informed him. "It was touch and go, but he's a fighter. We had to revive him, but he pulled through. The woman, however, is in a coma. We can't predict if or when she'll regain consciousness." Relief and concern swirled within Robert as he nodded. "Can I see the baby?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Please. I know it may sound strange, but I hardly know him. Still, I feel an overwhelming need to protect him. I need to make sure he's okay." In the neonatal intensive care unit, Robert approached the small crib, where the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor offered a semblance of comfort. Jason lay there, surrounded by wires and monitors, so fragile yet resilient. Then something caught Robert's attention. A tiny ID bracelet encircled the baby's wrist. Leaning closer, he read the name etched into the tag. Jason. Robert's thoughts spiraled. Jason. The name he and Victoria, his ex-girlfriend, had chosen for a child they once dreamed of having together. Memories surged forward, raw and poignant. They had envisioned a life that never came to be, a future that unraveled months before he had married Erin. Now, standing there, Robert's world tilted once more, teetering between disbelief and a dawning realization. How could this be mere coincidence? As Robert Edwards watched little Jason sleeping peacefully, a torrent of memories and unanswered questions flooded his thoughts. The child's striking resemblance to him, the name inscribed on the bracelet, and the unmistakable crescent-shaped birthmark, all seemed to whisper of a truth he wasn't ready to confront. His heart pounded wildly, caught between the fear of the unknown and the faint hope of answers. "Who are you, Jason?" he whispered, gently placing his hand over the baby's tiny fingers. "And how are you going to change my life?" The questions lingered in the stillness of the room, unanswered, as the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the air. For now, the only thing Robert could hold on to was the fact that this little fighter had survived. The rest, the revelations, the impact, the truth, would have to come in time. For a moment, Robert allowed himself to simply exist in the presence of the child who, despite the chaos, felt inexplicably like he belonged in Robert's life. The following morning, as dawn broke over the horizon, Robert fastened baby Jason securely into the car seat and began the drive home. The golden light of early morning spilled across Georgia Road, bathing everything in a soft, ethereal glow. His heart was a tangled mess of emotions: relief that Jason had been entrusted to his care, and overwhelming anxiety about what lay ahead. How could he possibly explain all of this to Erin, his wife? The doctor's words echoed in his mind. The baby is ready to go home, but he'll require special attention. Glancing over at Jason, whose peaceful expression seemed to defy the turmoil of the past days, Robert murmured softly, "Don't worry, little one. I'll be here for you, no matter what." As the familiar sight of Robert's mansion came into view, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. Cradling Jason gently in his arms, he approached the door, each step feeling heavier with the weight of anticipation. Just as he reached for the doorknob, it swung open with force. Standing there was Erin, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her face a mix of anger and anguish. "Where were you? You disappeared without a word all night," she demanded, her voice raw with emotion. "I was worried sick, imagining every possible horrible scenario, and now you show up with—" Her voice faltered as her gaze landed on Jason. Her expression shifted to one of disbelief and confusion as her eyes locked onto the child. Robert slipped inside quickly, closing the door behind him. "Erin, please, let me explain," he began. His tone calm yet pleading, but his words were interrupted by a sharp, bitter laugh. "Explain what? That you've secretly fathered a child? That you've been unfaithful to me?" she shot back, her voice trembling with fury. Her gaze narrowed on Jason as her eyes fell on the small crescent-shaped birthmark on his cheek, a perfect reflection of Robert's own. Erin's face went pale, drained of all color, as the pieces began to fall into place. Why does that baby have your birthmark?" Erin whispered, her voice trembling as she stumbled backward. Robert Edwards carefully placed Jason on the sofa, arranging pillows around the baby to ensure his safety. He turned to Erin, raising his hands in a gesture of reassurance. "Erin, I swear, I don't know who he is. I found him last night, out in the woods," he explained earnestly. "A beggar had him." But Erin wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on Jason, her expression a tumultuous blend of fury and heartbreak. "How long, Robert? How long have you been lying to me?" she demanded, her voice low and cutting. The tension in the room grew heavy, pressing down on them both. Robert took a cautious step forward, but Erin recoiled as though his presence might harm her. "Erin, I've never been unfaithful to you," he said firmly, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of pain. "I love you, but this baby—" He was alone, abandoned in the woods. I couldn't just leave him there. His words acted like a spark to dry tinder. Erin's eyes flared with anger, her voice rising as she stepped closer to him. "You find a baby, lost in the woods, and just bring him into our home? What about our plans, Robert? Our family? Not a single thought for me, huh?" Her words echoed through the spacious house, each one sharper than the last. Robert felt his own temper flare, a surge of frustration welling up from months of unresolved tension. "Not think about you?" he shot back, his voice rising to match hers. "What about those nights you disappear, Erin? Coming back late, smelling like someone else's perfume?" Her eyes widened in shock, and Robert pressed on, his words tumbling out in an emotional torrent. "You think I didn't notice? The stolen glances, the whispered phone calls? Maybe, just maybe, this baby is our chance to do something right, to bring some honesty back into all this distrust." The sound of a slap shattered the air. Erin moved so quickly that Robert barely registered the stinging heat on his cheek. She stood before him, trembling, her hands still raised, her face a mixture of rage and anguish. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice quivering. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath, heavy with words that neither of them dared to speak. "How dare you?" Erin whispered, her voice trembling as tears streamed down her face. "I never betrayed you, not once. All those nights, I was planning a surprise, a getaway, so we could finally try for a baby ourselves." Her bitter laugh rang through the room, sharp and filled with pain. "How ironic, isn't it? I dreamed of a family, our family, and here you are, bringing a stranger's child into our home." Jason's cries broke through the tense silence like a knife. Robert instinctively moved toward the baby, but Erin stepped in his path, her hands raised defensively. "Don't you touch him," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "That baby has no place here. He's not ours." He became aware of two things. One, his age. Robert's voice, thick with desperation, rose above the infant's wails. "He's innocent, Erin. He's not to blame for any of this," he pleaded, his eyes locked on hers. The sound of hurried footsteps approaching the hallway shattered the moment. The housekeeper appeared, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Sir," she stammered, "the police are here." Her words struck like a thunderclap. Robert and Erin turned toward the front door in stunned silence. Through the glass, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the night. Robert's heart pounded as his thoughts raced. Had someone reported finding Jason in the woods? Or was this about something else entirely? Something he hadn't yet pieced together? As if in slow motion, the doorbell echoed through the mansion. Jason's cries grew louder, sensing the suffocating tension in the air. Robert shifted his gaze from Erin to the baby, and finally to the door. He knew that opening it would change everything. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he stepped forward. Questions swirled in his mind. What were the police here for? How would this alter Jason's fate? Most painfully, could he still salvage what remained of his marriage to Erin? He knew the answers waited on the other side of that door, and there was no turning back. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing two officers standing solemnly in the doorway. "Mr. Robert Edwards, we need you to come with us to the station," said the taller officer, his voice calm but commanding. "You need to answer questions about the baby you brought from the hospital. Please accompany us." Robert nodded wordlessly, his chest tightening under the weight of Erin's piercing stare. The consequences of his decision to bring Jason home were unfolding faster than he could comprehend. He struggled to keep his voice steady as he asked, "Can you at least tell me what I'm being accused of?" The shorter officer replied in an even tone. "No formal charges have been filed, sir, but there are suspicions of child abduction." The ride to the station was a suffocating silence, thick with unspoken words. Erin insisted on accompanying Robert, her face unreadable, a mask of anger and disappointment. Each time Robert tried to explain, the officers cut him off, advising him to save his statement for the interrogation. As the police car navigated the quiet streets, Robert's thoughts drifted back to Jason, now in the housekeeper's care. Was I right to act as I did, or have I upended my entire life for a child I barely know? The question hung heavily in his mind. At the station, Robert was led into a stark, sterile interrogation room. The detective seated across from him had a weathered face and sharp, penetrating eyes. "Mr. Edwards," the detective began, his voice flat, "we're investigating a report of a baby missing from Central Hospital about a week ago. The infant you brought home matches the description." Robert felt his stomach drop. Fighting to keep his voice steady, he explained, "I found him in the woods last night. He was with a homeless woman. I brought him to the hospital because there was no one else to care for him while she was admitted." His words came out hurried, desperate, but truthful. The detective raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. Convenient story, isn't it? Especially considering your history with the baby's mother." Before Robert could process the implications of that statement, the door burst open. A woman strode in, her face a mixture of exhaustion, fury, and raw emotion. Her eyes were red from crying, and Robert felt a cold dread settle in his chest. It was Victoria, his ex-girlfriend. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage. "What did you do to him? Why did you let her take my baby from my arms? I had barely even held him. You had no right. Give him back, now!" She lunged toward Robert, but the officers quickly restrained her, holding her back. Trevor sat frozen, the weight of her words crashing over him. The pieces began to fall into place. The baby in the woods, the unmistakable birthmark, the name Jason. A truth he had been too afraid to acknowledge now stood clear before him, undeniable and devastating. The room erupted into pandemonium. Erin, who had been silently observing from a shadowed corner, stepped forward, her eyes blazing as she confronted Victoria. "Your son? What on earth are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp and her face a mixture of fury and disbelief. Victoria turned to face Erin, her expression fierce and unrelenting. "Robert," she said, jabbing her finger in his direction, "is the father of my son. The son who was apparently snatched away by some beggar woman," she accused, her words slicing through the air like knives. Robert tried to rise from his seat, desperation written across his face, but an officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder, pressing him back down. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know," he pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. The detective, sensing the situation spiraling out of control, raised his voice to cut through the noise. "Ladies, please, calm down. Mr. Edwards, we need you to recount, step by step, exactly what transpired last night." Taking a deep, steadying breath, Robert began. His voice was strained but clear as he described every moment of the previous evening, from stumbling upon Kristen and the baby in the forest along Georgia Road to the frantic trip to the hospital. He recounted every detail. As he spoke, he couldn't help but notice the shift in Erin's and Victoria's expressions. The anger that had once burned in their eyes softened into something resembling confusion, and then, reluctantly, comprehension. When Robert finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room, oppressive and weighty. The detective leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Your story is, to say the least, highly unusual, Mr. Edwards," he said, his tone measured. "However, a witness at the hospital has corroborated part of it. The woman you encountered, Kristen, is in a coma. We've identified her as an escaped psychiatric patient." Victoria's shoulders sagged and she buried her face in her hands, her voice breaking as she sobbed. "My baby, my little Jason, in that woman's hands for an entire week." The anguish in her voice filled the room, making even Aaron flinch. Aaron, still visibly shaken but no longer as combative, retreated to a corner. Her gaze remained fixed on Robert, a tumultuous mix of doubt and lingering anger clouding her eyes. The detective's demeanor turned more formal as he straightened in his chair. "Mr. Edwards," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "while it appears parts of your account may be true, there are still significant gaps and unanswered questions. You are free to leave for now, but I must insist you remain within the city limits. We will need to collect additional statements in the coming days." Robert nodded, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. He glanced at Victoria, whose tears were still falling, and then at Aaron, whose icy silence cut deeper than any words. The reality of what lay ahead loomed over him like a shadow, promising no easy resolution. Robert gave a heavy nod, the weight of exhaustion, both physical and emotional, bearing down on him as he moved toward the door. His eyes met Victoria's, and his voice faltered. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I truly didn't know." For a moment, Victoria held his gaze, her expression a mixture of sorrow and disbelief, before turning away, silent tears tracing down her cheeks. Aaron, on the other hand, left the room without a word, her presence a storm of anger and betrayal, leaving Robert to grapple alone with the consequences of his choices. The atmosphere between Robert, Victoria, and Aaron was unbearably tense, every breath heavy with unspoken words. Turning back to Victoria, Robert's voice cracked with frustration and pain. "Why didn't you tell me, Victoria, about the child? My child." His words trembled with the emotions he had kept buried for too long. Victoria's tears continued to fall as she stared at him, her face etched with years of hidden pain. "Do you think it was easy for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I found out I was pregnant after we broke up. You had already moved on. With her," she added, motioning toward Aaron, who stood nearby, her face a blend of shock and resentment. Robert stepped closer to Victoria, his hands shaking with emotion. "I had a right to know," he insisted, his voice rising. "You can't just—" His words were abruptly cut short as the sharp ring of the detective's phone sliced through the tension like a knife. The detective picked up, his face shifting from curiosity to alarm as he listened. After a moment, he hung up and turned to face them, his tone grave. "Kristen, the woman who abducted the baby, has regained consciousness and managed to escape from the hospital." The words hit them all like a thunderclap. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Aaron visibly paled. A cold shiver ran down Robert's spine. "How? How could this happen? Wasn't the hospital supposed to be secure?" Robert demanded, his voice taut with disbelief. The detective shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. "We're still piecing it together. All I know is she's gone, and we're deploying every resource to find her." Victoria's demeanor shifted abruptly. Rising to her feet, she brushed away her tears, her face set with a fierce resolve. "I need to see my son, now, before she tries anything else. I'm not waiting another second," she declared, her tone firm and unwavering. Robert hesitated for a moment before nodding, acknowledging the urgency in her voice. He could feel Aaron's eyes boring into him, a mix of accusation and disbelief. "He's at our home," Robert said quietly. "He's safe," he added, hoping to reassure both women. Victoria glanced at him, her determination unshaken. "Then let's go," she said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "Jason needs to be brought home where he belongs." Her words resonated in the room, leaving no room for doubt or delay. Robert felt as though he'd been punched in the stomach. The weight of the situation pressed on him, making it difficult to breathe. He wanted to argue, to assert his rights as a father, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the time. After a long, tense pause, he finally relented. "All right, let's get Jason," he said, though each word felt like a betrayal of his own heart.